They say loyalty is priceless until the people you love start calculating your worth. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and for a decade, I was the silent force behind Roseland Atelier, a once struggling fashion boutique that blossomed into a national name. The brand belonged to my wife's family, but the late-night forecasts, the endless meetings with prickly investors, the grueling product recalls I managed to turn into success stories, that was me. I wasn't just a chief operating officer. I was the ballast that kept the ship steady. Every decision I made was grounded in one promise: to prove I belonged not just in the company, but in their family. So, when I stepped into the conference room on a Friday morning with a fresh strategy proposal in hand, I expected the usual routine: discussions, disagreements, maybe a win. What I got was something else entirely. Sitting at the head of the table was Camille, my sister-in-law, with a smug look that made my stomach turn. And beside her, my wife, Isla, face unreadable, arms folded tight like she'd rehearsed this moment for days. "We're moving in a new direction," Camille said, her voice coated in that sickly sweet tone she used when delivering bad news. "We need leadership with more edge. You've become too comfortable, too predictable." I stood there, stunned, the words colliding in my brain like a car crash in slow motion. I turned to Isla, searching for a flicker of resistance, a single word in my defense, anything. But she wouldn't even look at me, her eyes fixated on the glass water pitcher like it held the answers. In that moment, I realized something far more painful than being fired. I realized I'd never really been one of them. Not to Camille, not to Isla. I was a placeholder, tolerated as long as I delivered results, and disposable the moment I didn't fit their vision of sleek, disruptive glamour. I nodded. "All right," I said, voice steady despite the wildfire building in my chest. "Good luck." Then I left, proposal still in hand, and walked out of the very empire I helped build, fired like an outsider, dismissed like a relic. What they didn't know was that the foundation they were standing on had my name written all over it, and they'd just pulled out the wrong pillar. Back home, I sat in the silence of a house that no longer felt like mine. The marble countertops, the cold chrome fixtures, the tastefully curated artwork Isla had picked out, they all stared back at me like reminders of how misplaced I was in my own life. I dropped the proposal on the kitchen island, the crisp edge of the folder catching against a fruit bowl I hadn't touched in weeks. The air inside felt thick, not with heat, but with absence. No music from Isla's playlist, no smell of her perfume floating down the hallway, no clatter from the espresso machine she once used every morning like ritual. It was as if her presence had evaporated the moment Camille fired me, and maybe, just maybe, it had been fading long before that. I walked into the living room, dropped onto the couch, and stared at the ceiling, the texture of it suddenly unfamiliar. The truth was screaming now, louder than the silence. I had built my life around people who never saw me as one of their own. 8 years of marriage, 10 years of growing Roseland Atelier from boutique to powerhouse, 1,000 nights staying late, handling crises so that Camille could shine at industry panels and Isla could post dreamy aesthetic shots from our Bali supplier visits. I'd sacrifice dinners, birthdays, and friendships. I even ignored the quiet whispers in my gut telling me Isla was becoming more of a public figure than a partner. And now, I was predictable. That word rang in my head like an insult carved in stone. Predictable because I didn't play politics? Predictable because I wasn't flashy enough to trend on fashion blogs? Predictable because I kept the company solvent while Camille gambled with branding strategies and Isla spent on image over infrastructure? And now, I was predictable. That word rang in my head like an insult carved in stone. Predictable because I didn't play politics? Predictable because I wasn't flashy enough to trend on fashion blogs? Predictable because I kept the company solvent while Camille gambled with branding strategies and Isla spent on image over infrastructure? The betrayal wasn't just the firing. It was the way they did it. Like I was a stranger, a minor inconvenience they could remove with a few signatures and a quick PR spin. There was no fight, no disagreement, no attempt to have a conversation. Just Camille with her smirk and Isla with her vacant silence. I stood up, restless, walked to the bookshelf in my study, half filled with design journals, legal handbooks, and a few mementos from supplier visits. My fingers traced over a brass photo frame. Me and Isla, 4 years ago in Florence, beaming in front of a tailor shop we were considering acquiring. I picked it up, stared, and almost laughed. She had already slipping away then, hadn't she? My phone buzzed on the desk. A message from Leo, our senior accountant. Heard what happened. I doubt Camille read the merger docs from 2018. You might still have a card to play. My brows furrowed. The 2018 merger. The one we acquired that struggling Scandinavian accessories brand, Helvik Studio. I negotiated every clause of that deal when Isla's father still ran things. It had taken 6 months of late-night calls, travel, and compromise. And in the end, Helvik's IP had been folded under a new holding entity. I hadn't thought about it in years. I replied, "What do you mean?" Leo responded in seconds. "You were listed as co-chair of the IP entity. Full sign-off rights. They can't license anything without your name." A slow burn spread through my chest, part shock, part vindication. I rummaged through my desk drawer and pulled out a dusty leather folder labeled M&A 2018 Helvik. I hadn't touched it in ages. My hands moved fast, almost trembling, as I flipped through the pages until I found it. Section 9.2, Line 3. Ethan Caldwell named co-chair of Roseland IP Holdings with authority over all intellectual property licensing decisions related to subsidiary assets. I dropped into my chair. The paper was shaking in my hand, or maybe it was just me. Camille and Isla hadn't just fired me. They'd tried to erase me. But they'd forgotten the foundation. And now that foundation had teeth. I let the realization settle. They couldn't touch Roseland's designs, trademarks, patents without my consent. The contract trembled in my fingers, though I tried to hold still. The house was silent except for the sound of the espresso machine hissing in the kitchen, Ila's favorite sound, now haunting in its familiarity. But the silence couldn't hold me anymore, not after what I just read. That one line in the Helvik merger documents had turned everything on its head. Co-chair of Roseland IP Holdings, veto authority over all licensing agreements related to subsidiary assets. It meant I wasn't just a sidelined executive. I was the one holding the crown jewels, the patents, the trademarks, the designs that Roseland's entire product line depended on. Without my signature, they couldn't legally produce, license, or ship anything tied to that arm of the business. They hadn't read the contract, or worse, they'd forgotten. I should have felt relief, maybe even satisfaction, but all I felt was fury, a rage that started deep in my chest and worked its way out like a pulse. It wasn't just about the firing anymore. It was about the insult, the betrayal, the years of sacrifice reduced to a cold "you're out" and a silent betrayal by the woman I built it all for. I stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. My reflection in the glass of the balcony door caught my eye. Eyes bloodshot, jaw tight, hair a mess. I looked like a man unraveling. But underneath, something was stitching back together. Not the man who smiled through boardroom slights, but the one who remembered how to wield silence as strategy. I picked up my phone and called Leo again. "Tell me," I said, no greetings, no preamble. "Does Camille need my sign-off for the fall collection's trademark license?" A pause. Then Leo chuckled darkly. "Without it, she can't even print the tags. Ethan, you're holding the line." I nodded. Good. I hung up and opened my laptop, fingers flying over the keyboard. I pulled up every contract I had access to, licensing agreements, vendor deals, manufacturer rights, and started making a list of every clause that hinged on Rosalind IP Holdings. It wasn't a short list. Then came the emails. Not angry, not accusatory, just decisive. 2. Rosalind Global Vendors. Subject: Immediate licensing review required. Dear partners, please be advised that all intellectual property associated with Rosalind Atelier's Helvik-linked assets are under review. Any pending or active licensing agreements are hereby frozen until further notice. Do not proceed with production, distribution, or marketing activities tied to these assets until authorized clearance is granted. Regards, Ethan Caldwell, Co-Chair, Rosalind IP Holdings. I blind copied Camille. I blind copied Ela. Within 24 hours, shipments stalled. Emails came flooding in from confused vendors in Portugal, Italy, South Korea. The new fall collection, Camille's passion project, relied heavily on the Nordic wool blends and scarf patterns we acquired through Helvik. And now, every thread of it was locked behind my signature. The first message from Ela came 3 hours later. "Ethan, what's going on? I'm hearing vendors can't get approval codes. Can we talk?" I didn't reply. Camille's email was colder. "This kind of stunt is beneath you. If there's an issue, let's resolve it civilly." No, no more civility. Not when they tried to throw me away like yesterday's press release. By the end of the week, social media accounts had gone dark. Rosalind's PR team stopped posting. Influencers expecting their fall shipments were left hanging, confused, publicly asking what happened to the collaboration. Internally, the staff must have known something was off, because I started getting messages from mid-level managers. "Is this a hack? Should we hold off on development? Mr. Caldwell, are you still with us? Do we need new licenses for the Paris rollout?" The silence from the top was louder than ever. Camille wasn't replying to her own team anymore. Ela had vanished from her shared calendar. And I was right here, holding the pen they... David sat motionless in his home office. The only sound, the tick of the clock and the soft hiss of his espresso machine. It had been 48 hours since he sent the legal notice freezing all intellectual property tied to Aurora and Finch's core operations. And the silence that followed had been deafening. No calls from Vanessa, no emails from legal, just the steady collapse of a machine they never realized he was holding together. But outside his silence, the world was reacting. It started with a call from an old client, Reed from Access Tech. "What the hell is happening over there?" Reed asked. "I've got a $3 million product line stalled because Vanessa says she can't access the licensing." David calmly replied, That's because she can't. Not without me. Sit tight. Then came another call, and another. By noon, his phone was buzzing nonstop. Meanwhile, his inbox filled with messages from former colleagues, designers, developers, project managers, people who had been sidelined or pushed out by Vanessa and her cronies. Now they were reaching out to David. "You were always the reason Aurora worked," one wrote. "Starting something new? Count me in." One message stood out. It was from Claire Park, the former head of UX. She had left 6 months ago after Vanessa publicly humiliated her in a meeting. "David," she wrote, "if you're building anything at all, I'll follow." He stared at that message longer than the rest. The idea that had been quietly forming in his mind for days began to solidify. Maybe this wasn't about revenge anymore. Maybe this was about rebirth, about taking the ashes of something broken and building something better. By the next morning, the cracks at Aurora and Finch were wide open. A whistleblower leak hit one of the industry blogs. Top staff resignations and frozen patents leave Aurora in freefall. The article quoted anonymous sources, likely fed by Marco, highlighting how the company was paralyzed due to an overlooked merger clause and a silent war inside the executive floor. Investors panicked. 2 pulled funding. A key client canceled a licensing deal. Vanessa? She was nowhere to be seen. Rumor had it she was holed up with a crisis PR team, trying to spin the situation. Meanwhile, her sister Ivy blamed everything on Aurora's legal team. But no one was buying it. David was. Because while Aurora burned, he built. From a quiet co-working space on the east side of town, David began assembling a team. He hired Claire Park as head of product. Then came Miguel, a marketing genius who'd left Aurora when Ivy tried to slash his budget. By week's end, there were 12 people. Sharp, motivated, loyal, ready to launch something fresh. They named it Hollowroot Studios, after the street where David grew up. A nod to resilience, to roots that run deep, even when the surface seems dead. Clients followed. First Axis Tech, then Onvio, then Red Nest. The industry started whispering, "David's back. Hollowroot is the real Aurora now." He was the engine all along. Meanwhile, Vanessa tried damage control. She sent David a text. "I miss the way we used to work together. Can we talk?" He read it and deleted it without replying. Aurora's board, once enthralled by Vanessa's sleek pitch decks and PR charm, now turned cold. They began pushing for answers she didn't have. David had bled for that company. Now they were watching it bleed without him. He didn't smile at their downfall, not really. But when Claire walked into his new office one evening and said, "We just signed our 5th client this week," he finally allowed himself to exhale. He hadn't just survived, he'd risen. Weeks passed, and Hollowroot Studios didn't just grow, it flourished. Clients trusted David. His new team believed in the mission. Investors, once silent backers of Aurora and Finch, began reaching out, curious, impressed, eager to be part of something built on integrity rather than arrogance. But the biggest shift came with a phone call from Adrian Meyer, a senior board member from Aurora and Finch. "David," Adrian said, voice taut with urgency, "we're in a bind. The IP freeze has gutted operations. Sales are crashing. Vanessa's lost control. We need to talk." David stood by the window of his small but sunlit office at Hollowroot, his reflection cast on the glass, steady, unshaken. "You should have talked to me before the boardroom ambush," he said. "Not with malice, but clarity." "I know," Adrian admitted, "but we're ready to fix it. On your terms." The next day, David walked into the very boardroom where he'd once been humiliated. But this time, everything was different. The long mahogany table was lined with familiar faces, some ashamed, others hopeful. Vanessa was seated at the far end, her face pale, lips pressed thin. Ivy wasn't present. Word was she'd stepped down, citing personal reasons, though everyone knew what that meant. Adrian called the meeting to order. "This vote is about stability," he said, "about ensuring Aurora and Finch survives and thrives. We propose reinstating David Holloway, not as Chief Financial Officer, but as Executive Director of Intellectual Property. He will hold controlling authority over all patents, designs, and trademarks. Vanessa will be removed from executive decision-making roles effective immediately." The room went silent. Vanessa's voice cracked as she stood. "You can't be serious." Adrian didn't flinch. "We are, and the vote starts now." Hands rose, one by one, some reluctantly, others with firm resolve. When it was over, Adrian looked at David. "It's unanimous." David nodded, his face unreadable. He didn't gloat, he didn't sneer. He simply stood, straightened his blazer, and spoke with calm conviction. "I accept the position, but it comes with conditions." He pulled a stack of papers from his briefcase and slid them across the table. New bylaws, a restructure, a clause that ensures no team member can ever be terminated without due process and a binding review. That no founder, no spouse, no legacy name can override merit. We build a company that lasts, or I walk and the patents stay frozen. No one objected. Vanessa's eyes shimmered, not with anger, but disbelief. She knew in that moment what true leadership looked like, and it wasn't her. The next 6 months redefined everything. David kept his word. He rebuilt the company from the inside out. Claire led UX across all divisions. Marco returned to helm strategic finance. Harper from product branding joined under Hollermuth's merged operations team. And Clarissa, who once coldly watched his firing, now sent in daily reports, answering to his office. There was no revenge tour, no public shaming. David let the structure speak for itself. He knew that true recognition wasn't in taking power, it was in proving why it should always been his. Revenue returned. Clients regained faith. Internal surveys reported the highest morale in company history. One quiet Friday afternoon, as the sun painted the skyline gold, David walked past the lobby and paused near the main entrance. A new plaque had just been mounted. Aurora and Hollowroot. Reimagined, rebuilt, resilient. A young intern stood beside him and smiled. "They say you're the reason we're still here." David shook his head. "No," he said, "I'm just the reason we're doing it right this time." David stood by the window of his executive office, looking out at the city skyline that once felt cold and distant. But today, the glass reflected something different. A man who had been burned, humiliated, underestimated, and who rose not to destroy, but to rebuild. The journey from betrayal to redemption had tested every fiber of who he was. That morning in the boardroom, when Vanessa and Ivy dismissed him without a flicker of gratitude, had nearly broken him. But rather than retaliate in anger, David had chosen patience. He let their arrogance build the cage they would eventually trap themselves in. Through it all, he found his footing not by clawing his way back into their world, but by redefining his own. Hollowroot Studios became his sanctuary. It attracted not only talent, but loyalty, people who believed in building something real, something fair. And when the tides turned and the board begged him to return, David didn't seek revenge. He set new terms, stronger ones, wiser ones. Now, the once fractured company was thriving. The air buzzed with energy, not fear. Employees spoke up in meetings, departments collaborated like never before. Trust had become the foundation. And Clarissa? She sat in her office just down the hall, no longer untouchable, but accountable. Not out of bitterness, but because leadership must be earned, not inherited. David took a sip of his coffee, the bitter taste grounding him in the present. He had all the reasons in the world to become spiteful, but he didn't. Instead, he proved that the most powerful form of revenge is success, born of integrity. That's the lesson he carries with him, and the one he leaves for anyone listening. When the world underestimates you, don't waste time proving them wrong out of anger. Build something they can never ignore. Rise so tall that they have no choice but to look up. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and comment below. Have you ever been underestimated, betrayed, or cast aside? How did you rise? We'd love to hear your story. And if you want more powerful narratives of justice, resilience, and redemption, subscribe to the channel and join a community where every story ends with strength.